Well, welcome back to Along the Road. I'm Pastor Josh here in Kingston, New Hampshire.
And I'm Katie, the Children's Discipleship Director.
And we are just excited to have you with us as we've been going along the road, talking about our faith and how it matches with life and how we interact with things. We cover a wide variety of things around here.
We do.
We really do. And we're a couple weeks off of Easter now, and spring is definitely in the air.
Hallelujah.
I've seen the green shoots, and the little, daffodils are coming up, and that is a wonderful time. I think we all like that. But today's topic is less about spring, and I think it's a little heavier, but it's something that we don't touch on very often, or a lot of people don't. And sometimes I think a lot of believers struggle with it in different ways, depending on what's happening. And today we want to talk about the theology or the doctrine of suffering. What does it mean to suffer? Why do we suffer? Why do people suffer? Sometimes it's short, sometimes it's a lifelong thing or a whole season of suffering. And it's a question that's been asked, I don't know how many times in life, but also you see it in Scripture. You see people asking God about it. You see disciples asking Jesus about it. Why is this person this way? Did his parents sin? And Jesus says, no, that's not what happened. And so trying to figure that out in life. And then as a believer, how do we suffer? There is an idea called suffering well, which I struggle to wrap my head around. But a lot of this came through. I think recently we've had some close people in our church that are receiving bad news, and it's hard, and that kind of sparks that memory of, well, suffering's difficult. What does that mean?
Right.
And so, to go off of this, I found an article. Always got to find something, and they very fairly put a lot of this into a very nice package. I think it's a good intro, even though it may feel long, into suffering, because as we discussed a little bit right before we started recording, each of these little sections could be an entire deep dive themselves. So don't take this as like the end all be all. This is a good putting your toe in the water as to what suffering is, and that really there is a doctrine of suffering within Scripture. There's parts to it that would comfort any believer into what it means. And so, the questions that this person asks is, why me? What is God doing? Is God using suffering? We hear that he uses it as a tool, and it's all different ways of things. But he starts off with quoting Ecclesiastes chapter 7. In verse 14, it says, "In the day of prosperity, be joyful, and in the day of adversity, consider. God has made the one as well as the other, so that man may not find out anything that will be after him." And I think that is a very good starting point, because we are joyful in the day of prosperity. When things are going well, when we feel like, oh, we've had a blessed day. But when we've had bad days, bad months, bad seasons, we often don't attribute that to God. But the writer said God has made both. He's made both so we have a fuller, deeper understanding of life and what it is. Many people won't know, Paul says, I've learned how to be in plenty, and I've learned how to be in want, in need or in suffering. He's been beaten in prison, and he's been treated very well. And all of those are part of the life that we have.
He says in Romans 12, be joyful in hope and patient in suffering.
Absolutely.
And faithful in prayer.
Yeah. And so the question is, what is the purpose? Why do we suffer? And this
Can we avoid it?
This guy says we when he says off of Ecclesiastes that we're to consider that day of adversity, it means to think about it. What does it mean? And his questions are, how am I responding to this? How should I respond? Am I learning from this? Does my response demonstrate faith? Sometimes it does, and sometimes it doesn't. And so, how can God use this suffering in my life?
Right. So if God is, I don't know that author is the right word, but if God provides suffering, we have a tendency, all right, let me just rush through this and get to a better place. And this is saying, no, wait a minute. It's here for a purpose. You'd best discover what that purpose is.
Understand his purpose, know what it means. Or we also tend to just point God for bad things. You must not be a good God because you've done this. I now doubt my faith because of this. And I think
it's a famous book. Why do bad things happen to good people?
Exactly. And in a very simple view, I think any parent has at least a small understanding of that. There are times you let your children suffer, or or they won't learn the lesson. They won't be better for it.
Yeah.
They won't grow out of that. And that doesn't make me God, and I don't always get it right. And maybe sometimes I should have let them suffer at this point, but we do have that understanding.
Consequences, yeah.
That those consequences, or let them struggle through that. Let them learn the hard way this time. Or they have chosen to go against this, and then you would so come down with the promise you said. All of those things to a child, that's suffering that is caused by mom or dad or both. And they may be mad at you, they may be this, but often when that child gets older, you'll hear, especially loving parents, you'll hear, thank you. You helped me in this. You disciplined me, or you did this so that I would be a better person, so that I would see Christ. So in a smaller picture, we as parents, or anyone who's helped children or taught them or led people, sometimes you let that happen. You let them fall on their face. They learn from it.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes, somebody gets a little shock, when they're working on it. Well, they won't be touching it that way again. It's that type of thing.
Mm-hmm.
And so there is a purpose to what it means. And so this author says, well, let's first define just what we mean by suffering, because it's a pretty broad term.
Mm-hmm.
It's pretty big. So this is how they define it. Simply stated, suffering is anything which hurts or irritates. I mean, the rock in my shoe could make me suffer, and the loss of a friend can make me suffer. They're vastly different.
The thorn on a rose bush.
Yeah,
right?
They're vastly different. It says, in God's design, it is also something to make us think. It is a tool God uses to get our attention, to accomplish his purpose in our lives in a way that would never occur without trial or irritation. And so, just thinking of different illustrations, different ways of suffering that people have. Sometimes you suffer just because you're a believer. And in the work world, everyone wants to behave in a certain way, and you don't. So they don't want to befriend you as much. They don't want to invite you as much. That's a type of suffering. Sometimes we suffer just because we got in a car accident, and we have to recover, and we have to deal with the pain of that. We have to,
live in a fallen world.
And so where are we learning from that? And some of our suffering is physical ailments. Some people with short-term ones or long-term ones, people that have autoimmune diseases or cancer, and you will go through a suffering, or you suffer because your friend or spouse is going through something.
Yeah.
So there are all different ways to suffer.
Mm-hmm.
But what causes those suffering is a little different. And that's kind of what he talks about here. That we suffer, number one, I think the first one to remember is we suffer because we live in a fallen world where sin reigns in the heart of men. So we are in a world where not everybody follows God. Not everybody even wants to believe he exists. But he is the one that created them all, and we are fallen. In Adam, we all sin. And so there will be suffering in that, because everybody is after their own good. And they want to be their own little God. Even believers are battling that in themselves. So that's going to cause us to make mistakes. It's cause us to go against the law. That's going to cause us to do selfish things. And so that suffering is because of the sinfulness, in this broken world. And that's how it is. Number two is my favorite. We suffer because of our own foolishness.
And why is it your favorite?
It's my favorite because we never like to remember you are in this position because you did this thing. Why am I this? You get all mad about the speeding ticket, but you were the one going fast. You did that.
Yeah, but it wasn't my fault that I was running late.
I was running late. And so, but we have our own foolishness. We suffer emotionally because we choose to hide things. That's our own foolishness.
Blame someone else.
Children and even adults sometimes will not tell the truth because they're afraid of what's going to happen. So if you're afraid, well, you should have just said the truth, even though that could have hurt too. It would have hurt less. And so suffering in our own foolishness, that reaping what we sow type of thing. People who live a life on the edge, or live a life of trying to get away with things, or a life of, if they begin to steal things and you get caught, you're suffering because of that. If you are seeking out the power of the office that you're in or where you are, and you'll do anything to climb the ladder, suffering will come from that. And you may not notice it at first. Mm-hmm. It could be also the suffering of the relationship with your family or your spouse. And there are people I know that in that instance, they have put work first. And 10 years later, they're having a separation and there's a divorce happening. And where's all the suffering coming from? I thought, I love the Lord. And they didn't recognize how often, and the warning signs, and other people had said, you're putting work first, you're overworking, and it led to this type of thing. And unless they recognize that they're suffering, they're going to blame on someone else, Yeah. But you have your own acts to deal with. And
then there's the people who see driving as a game.
Yes, you can do that too, and that'll turn into some trouble for some people as well. Another thing he says is, we sometimes suffer because it is God's discipline. And that's a very interesting concept. That's different than the disciples asking about this man's suffering that his parents sinned. Yeah. They were seeing that not as God's discipline, but as more like a straight punishment. It's a generational thing. This is what happens. But, God disciplines the people by not providing something so that he can get their attention.
Right. Because there's a difference between punishment and discipline.
There is. You see that with the nation of Israel often. You can see that with the church. There's this idea that he is getting your attention. It says in Hebrews 12, for those whom the Lord loves, he disciplines. He scourges every son he receives. It's that idea that he trains them. That's part of discipline. It's not always just, a rod or something like that. There is a training that goes with it.
I like the idea of pruning better.
Yes. Yeah. And you see that.
Because there is still suffering with pruning.
Yeah.
But it's much more positive.
John writes about that pruning of the vine, the pruning of the branches, and that's part of it. And we need that to be more shaped into Christ. Just because you have chosen Christ doesn't mean you are exactly like Christ anymore. You have to be shaped into that. And as you grow, I believe, the more mature a Christian is, they realize, I had to suffer because I didn't want to let go of this habit. And that caused problems until finally you let it go. That's a type of discipline, and so that's that pruning and discipline. We suffer persecution because of our faith. We talked about that a little bit. We stand on biblical issues. But it's just a reminder, not all of these apply at the same time. You may be suffering at this, or you're suffering over here.
Which imply you need to reflect.
Yeah, you need to, and sometimes it is just because we're in a broken world. I think the harder ones for us at times are the ones where someone who's suffering a physical ailment like cancer, and it's because we're in a broken world. We're in a world that is marked by sin. Even all of nature is marked by that, and it is fallen, and will be renewed at some day. So of course our bodies don't work perfectly in these, so that is a part of our suffering, and we recognize what that is. And so he has a long list here of the nature of suffering, and I really like that it's very thoughtful in the way it's broken down. I probably would require a lot of time to actually think through all of this because we don't like to think about suffering very much. But the first one is just the most simple. Suffering is painful. When you have a chronic illness, it is difficult. If you are riddled with anxiety, that is very hard. And it is a suffering, and we need to recognize that. That maybe you don't have that problem, but when you see someone with that, there is a pain that goes with it. I would say all types of suffering also have a pain aspect to it, whether it's a physical pain or an emotional pain. There is something that happens there. There's a grieving of, I used to be able to do this, and now I can't do this. I can't move like I used to. I can't think like I used to. That's a type of suffering that is painful and part of our broken world. Suffering, he says next, is also perplexing. There's a mystery to it. How often, and I don't know if I know this happened several times in my life, if something happens to somebody and you go, why them? Why that person? Maybe you saw them as a faithful person, someone who loved the Lord. You didn't see them as someone who was doing foolish things and suffering because of their behaviors and stuff.
Yeah. So it's not obvious.
So why did that happen to that person? Why did this person suddenly pass away, leaving a spouse and 2 children, and that's a type of suffering, and it's very perplexing, and it's mysterious in its causes and where it goes, and I think if we could always understand exactly the why for everything, I've said this before, then we are putting God way too small in that sense, because his why and his picture of shaping each person to become like him, or reaching out to others to become like him, is something that we could never imagine. And I think of a friend of mine from Moody, that his wife was martyred. They were living in the Middle East, and one day someone came up to the clinic that she worked at and shot her in the head, and they had to rush him out of the country. It was very dangerous times. I remember him talking on the news in that country before he left about forgiving these shooters, and going through this process. And I saw him at Moody soon after that happened. He had returned and spent time in prayer. But his life is very interesting because that suffering is obviously painful and lifelong. But then God has also since used that, in the last it's been a little over 20 years, to reach many people, to open the doors to the gospel to many people. God has even used that. He has since remarried to a person who also had her parents, or I believe it was her parents, that were martyred in a different country. And so the idea how their testimony makes a big difference, but so perplexing as to the why. Yeah. As to why at this time, why at this moment, why somebody, his testimony, wild and crazy and didn't come to the Lord till his teens and all over the place, and just finally in this place where he's really serving God, married, like it's like as if God lined all the stars up and here we are, we're on the mission field and we're doing this thing, and it literally falls apart. It's very perplexing.
Yeah. And he can see later down the road how God was working it for good, but certainly not at the time.
Not at the time. At the time, I remember the biggest thing for him is just trusting who God was. Yeah. And part of that trusting was the fact that in his spiritual immaturity, very brash type of guy, would always go crazy and things, God brought this woman into his life. And part of his trusting is that he knew she would have taught him to trust what God was doing, and that's how it's worked. But they've reached many people with that, and that's a part of what it says next in Romans chapter 8. The next part is suffering is also purposeful. Mm-hmm. What will it do to shape you? What will it do also, I believe, as you respond or as you go through it, to reflect to others who God is in your life. When you share with people, just like Ecclesiastes says, oh, I feel blessed and God has done these great things. You're in a good place. You feel like you're sharing about God to your neighbors or to your coworkers because of all these good things. But when it really comes down like this, and you're in a heart of suffering, and you still share with people that you trust God, the purpose in that is very different. And I think the ears to that are very different. Now, I think sometimes if it's a hard, quick type of suffering, you may not have that purpose in your speaking. Mm-hmm. Some people I know that have long-term suffering do. Mm-hmm. And they kind of go through this grieving process, essentially, of what was and where I am and how can God use me. And understand there's a purpose to this, to all of it. And it's not, we'd like to always think about us in suffering. The purpose is not just you. It could be your spouse. It could be your children. It could be your coworkers. It could be as you suffer and others see that suffering or partake in parts of it, they are seeing God shape in you, but they are also getting the reflection of that in your responses. So yeah, he also says suffering is a test. It's a proving. James chapter 1 talks about how the suffering tests our faith. You're coming up against that, the idea that we can be challenged. Are we going to say we still trust the Lord in these days? And I think that's hard, because I think probably in moments we doubt about that.
It's a pop quiz.
It's a pop quiz. We doubt about, is this difficult? And it doesn't mean you don't doubt, but will you stand the test to trust the God who is the author, as you said, or the one who is sovereign over everything. And to understand that. And I think the most difficult part, if you begin to get the feeling of some of these, you'll get the understanding that God is sovereign, which means suffering is part of his plan.
Mm-hmm.
Always has been. It has been used to shape people to see the need of him and to reflect who he is.
Yep.
And so it does test us. It can test also the singular us, but it can also test a gathering or a corporate group, a gathering of believers. They can be suffering for different ways, and some of their suffering could be their own issues. As we've been preaching through Corinthians, they had their own issues, but that's a suffering. Are they going to divide? Is this body going to stay together? But they're suffering because of their own foolishness, of their own sinful ways, because they're part of the world. All those lead up to it, but it is a testing of the church, or of that gathering, or of that family, or of that marriage. And it continues. I think it connects to his other ones. Suffering is a process. So it's not a once and done thing. There's this sanctification, becoming like Christ, and it's a purifier. I like those two.
Mm-hmm.
I believe suffering in a gathering of believers or in a marriage can purify things, can get rid of the selfishness.
Mm-hmm.
It can get rid of the my way is better than your way, as opposed to we are in this together for a vision for the Lord. And it's either that or it's going to fall apart. And that'll lead to more suffering and then more learning. And I've seen both. And I've seen people after the more suffering, after falling apart years down the road, wishing it wouldn't have happened, but finally learning the lesson. So it took longer in that process, mm-hmm. in that shaping of what it took. But that testing and that purifying in the process, it's getting rid of things from within you.
Mm-hmm.
I mark a lot of these things to someone who does any type of sport. You do a lot of suffering in sports. a lot of suffering in sports as a team and as an individual. You have both. In all of them, you have both. Mm-hmm. Whether it's a football team or a soccer team or baseball. Individuals must do their work, and they have to go to the gym or exercise on this or overcome their injuries, and there is a suffering to that. But even as a team, teams go through losing seasons. Are you going to be able to pull right? Is your character going to come together, or are you going to just sit there and argue at each other?
Point fingers.
And not take the blame and not improve on these things. But are you going to not see the process of this? And so if it is like that in the reality of non-believing, just sports world,
mm-hmm.
I mean, that's all a mark of how God works. It is so much more like that in the reality of our spiritual world and our faith with God,
mm-hmm.
that we need to see that this is part of our getting better. So much we have that bad view on suffering.
Well, and I think that our culture doesn't remember very well the value of hard work.
Right.
And that it takes time and that it's not an instant thing.
Yeah.
And so as a result, we want things to be over quickly so that we can move on.
We want to learn the lesson fast. We want to hit the button and go on.
Yeah.
But that idea, that's why I love the sports metaphor, and even Paul uses it later on in Corinthians and other places, that sports metaphor is important because there is the mentality of an athlete,
mm-hmm.
of mastering something doesn't mean you've made it. And mastering an art form means that you will be working on it for the rest of your life. It means you're going to be shaping it. It means that 10 years from now, you're going to look back at what you did and say, some of what I did, I would never do again. Mm-hmm. I've learned not to. I've grown it, and I've struggled through this. I've hardened my hands in this, or I twisted my ankle too many times this way. And so I learned to do it this way. And so there's that process. And each one of those, in any other part of our life, is marked with suffering, and we think that's okay. You go to a job, you're at the bottom of the totem pole, and you suffer because you have to do and go get the coffee, or they treat you like this, and go to
get the worst choice
and
for
you have
vacation.
to work your way up, but what do you do if you want to do that? And especially if you really like the place, it's not toxic, but you really like this, and you recognize they see my value, but I have to earn my way to these places.
I have to swallow.
You work hard, you break bad habits, you listen carefully, and you suffer. Part of it is the suffering, but you don't sit there and blame anybody for it. You go, I see the end goal.
Right.
And for a believer, our end goal is, I want to be more like Christ.
Mm-hmm.
So in our suffering, you've entered into this. And at this moment or in this season, suffering is part of getting to the end goal. It's that purpose. It's that process. That's why he says also it provides an opportunity. Mm-hmm. But then he also says it requires cooperation. And that was one I would have never thought of had I not read this little article.
Yeah.
That it requires that I am participating in my suffering. I'd rather just suffer and whine and cry and just leave me alone.
Tell me when it's over.
Feel bad and get through it. But I participate. So like you were saying, I have to take the time to think through this. Like he said about Ecclesiastes. Consider this day. In other words, chew on that thought. Mm-hmm. Process it through your mind. Am I suffering well? Am I seeing how it's shaping me? It might take weeks or months to recognize that some of your suffering is to shape part of your character. Because first you have to feel the pain and go through process it. But if you don't sit down and think, I am a part of, doesn't mean you're going to get out of it either. It's just once you cooperate, it changes everything. And you see that. I think you see that often, like I said, with sports teams, but I like the sports movies that are out, the champion movies, all these people.
Yeah.
A lot of times you have a lot of people that do suffer and they do this, but until the team members all begin to see, if we work within this, this will work. So they're all great individuals. They're all growing in themselves, but they're suffering more and more because they're not actually cooperating. They're not actually saying, I buy into this program and that team. And once they do, you see a complete shift. You see things coming together, and there's this thing, and they still suffer. It's still difficult. It still
requires work.
But now they see the growth that comes out of it. And so whether it's as an individual or in your local gathering, that cooperation with suffering is important, and recognizing where God stands in there. One that I think people struggle with the most is suffering is predetermined and inevitable. The second one, I think, is hard for people, but the first one, I think, is the hardest. Suffering is inevitable. It's going to happen.
And even Jesus said it.
Even Jesus said it.
In this world, you will have trouble.
And he uses 1 Peter 4:19 and 1 Thessalonians 3:3, and they talk about the suffering that is meant for us. But it's also predetermined. Part of the way you are being shaped is that there will be this pressure that comes upon you. And it's going to come in some form. And God will use that to his glory. I don't know how that always works. That's where the mystery is. That's where the perplexing parts are. but it is part of who he is in all of that suffering. And that makes it very difficult sometimes to look at the world and go, much suffering everywhere.
Yes.
But if we were to say so much suffering should be ringing the bells for people to know Christ and help us point people to Christ or point ourselves to Christ, I think it shifts the way you think about it, because it doesn't just go away. It's part of life, and I do use that often in our sermons because people come to faith, or people, there's a freedom in Jesus Christ, and often they think what the freedom means I no longer will have suffering. But suffering well means that when I suffer, when we're going through this as a body or as individuals, that underlying joy sits there because this suffering is given to me by God. It's inevitable. This suffering is predetermined, but that means he's working in me. And I trust him.
Yes, and as a parent, why do you discipline your children? Because you care about how they're going to grow up.
Yes.
You don't do it because you're vindictive or any of those other nasty adjectives.
Right.
You do it because you love them and you care.
Right.
And that's the way God sees us.
How he does. That's why it says he like a father would to a child. It says it in several places.
And there's the other one, God saved me just the way I am, but he loves me too much to leave me there.
Yeah. I mean, salvation is a beginning point.
Yeah.
Because that is that's the conversion, right? Salvation.
Right.
I've surrendered to Christ.
I recognize my need.
And I surrender my life to Christ. And we say famously at many churches and in our church, God has not called us to make converts. Converts, that's that moment, that time, somewhere in there. Maybe for some it was a little journey, but there is a time where you go, I recognize my need. I surrender to Christ. I believe in what he has done, in his life, his death, his resurrection, and in that I believe. He's called us to make disciples, which means if we're lifelong learners, that means this is the beginning point. It's like you got into college, you got into the program, or whatever you want to call it, but you have to learn and change and grow from there.
Or if you run track and field, this is the starting point.
It's a starting point. You made the team. You got this place, and we have track and field. One of my kids had track and field in junior high, and so like first meet, okay, you have your numbers, but the goal is you should be quicker at the end of the season, little bits by little bits, and that's the goal. And they keep working at that. Not just, well, I made it, I'm in.
Right, now I'm done.
So the idea is there is this process, and it's this point, because it's not conversion we're talking about. We're talking about a lifelong process of growing, and our goal, in track is to get a faster time, to win a championship on a team. But our goal as believers is to be like Christ. And until we're with him, we will never fully be like Christ. So there's always that.
Something more to learn.
And sometimes it's victories that get us there, and other times it's suffering that gets us there. But suffering is part of that, and the one that we don't like to talk about as much. And it is a struggle.
I don't know anybody who enjoys suffering.
No, that's true. And the bottom one, he says, is this suffering, it's a struggle. I mean, that's kind of what we're saying. No one enjoys it. It is hard. And you could say that of any one of all the examples we would talk about in the sports world. Those Monday through Friday sessions, or those workout sessions, they are a struggle. If they get injured and they have to go through rehab, it's a struggle. But it's that end goal and that process that they're going to.
Sure.
He moves to talk about how we handle this with this inner set of joy. And he uses Psalm 119 to talk about this.
Which I don't think of Psalm 119
I wouldn't have
as
either.
Talking about suffering.
This eternal part of who God is, and suffering, and our inner joy and tranquility. We can look at this. So he says, he compared the blessings of affliction as seen in the testimony of the psalmist in Psalm 119. So before affliction, before suffering or affliction, we are straying and ignoring. That's verse 67. During affliction, we are learning and turning. I like that phrase. When under affliction, what are the things we need to do? Well, the psalmist says, determine the cause, determine the objectives, and determine the solutions. And then after the affliction, knowing and changing, and resting and valuing. And so I like that, the idea of what Psalm 119 draws into that. And so that's the picture of this. And some of the deeper items he does talk about is purposes and reasons. And we've talked about some of these. We suffer as a testimony or as a witness, to manifest the power of God to others, to glorify God before the angelic world. We suffer to develop our capacity of sympathy in comforting others. And I think that's one that most people, as you get older, you begin to see. Yeah. It is hard sometimes as a young believer, or age-wise young person, or a young pastor or a young youth pastor, when something really difficult happens, to really sympathize, to understand the suffering. Now, if maybe you're growing up, you had some really hard times, there's a maturity in that happens. But the idea of suffering a loss, when I was 20 or 22, I hadn't suffered any loss of friends, and tragedy happens. Sometimes people suffer a loss, and you're there. It's very, you haven't been able to share in that suffering. You can empathize, but you can't sympathize. Yeah. And there's a different process to that. Sure. But it develops that in us. Number 3, we suffer to keep down our pride. And Paul writes to that in 2 Corinthians to them, that some of your suffering is to basically keep you in check. This is where you are. We suffer because it's a training tool. We talked about that. It can shape us. He uses the word pruning. You talked about that. John chapter 15 talks about us being part of the vine and the branches. Right. And the pruning of those branches. You're never disconnected from the Holy Spirit. You're part of that, but parts of you have to be pruned off and shaped.
Because you grow better. Yeah. That's the way a grapevine works. Yeah. Because if you train the long things down the wires, then when the grapes come, They're all hanging in the sun, and they ripen better.
It's pretty nice. Yeah.
Yes.
So you need those training tools that you can use for it. He also says we suffer to bring about continued dependence on the grace and power of God. And I find that one's, I think for me, some of the easier ones to believe, because some suffering we recognize I can't do this on my own. I don't understand it. I mean, someone who's suffering a long-term ailment or even here in our modern day world, you have some physical ailments or some cancers and people are like, we're just doing the best we can. You get all the medical world and all the things here and they do everything they can, but they're still like, we are not sure. You can't be dependent on that. You can only be dependent on God at that point and what he's going to do with that. We suffer to manifest the life and character of Christ. Those are the fruit of the Spirit, and that can be done in different ways. The negative is we suffer when we're out of fellowship with the Lord. You know, you see that in the nation of Israel or in different people. When they're out of fellowship with the Lord, and if we're going to make more selfish decisions. We are going to suffer, even as believers. You know, we're not protected from that. We should be aligned with what God is doing, and we need to recognize that. We also suffer in a negative way when in fellowship with the Lord. So we hold the line. That's the suffering for integrity's sake or for righteousness' sake. People not understanding your faith, and you suffer for that. But he also says there's positive ways to it, that we suffer to manifest the evil nature of evil men and the righteousness and the justice of God when it falls in judgment.
That's a mouthful.
It is a mouthful. But in essence, the way we suffer shows the evil of the world and shows the righteousness that God has. But that's part of our suffering. And there's a positive nature to that because it is a clear beacon to the world, which leads to the last one, that we suffer to broaden our ministries. And I think, like we said earlier, the world around you, whether it's your immediate family or extended family or co-workers, they are constantly watching each other. You watch them, they watch you. And if they know some of your suffering or what's going on, and they hear what is happening, hear the honest struggle, they hear the steadfast faithfulness in Christ and the learning and growing in what he has, it is quite a broadening of your ministry, you know, that you can reach out to. Some people will listen to you if you have suffered as compared to if you haven't. So you actually have that, same as that sympathy thing. You have that extra open door to speak to someone, you know. Because
you do know what they're going through.
You do know what they're going through. If you have suffered loss in life of a close relative or a spouse or a child, and someone else is going through that, it actually opens that, I know I have lost my own this, or I know what. And if not, you can say, I have not suffered that way. I don't know what you're going through. This is what I have experienced, which might be similar enough, and they can see that. But it opens that door to, as a believer, I suffer too. Yeah. Life is not perfect. And we do this because this is a broken world, but I'm trusting in God. You know, and so he marks, you know, Philippians that Paul writes to, that consider it all joy. Yeah. The suffering that we're going through, because how it opens the door, which is a phenomenal statement that we like to sit on the joy parts. We like to sit on this, but consider it the suffering is the joy, that the struggle, it becomes a beacon to the world. It shapes us more like Christ. It shows that we're in God's hands, and there's a lot of pieces to it. So not often do we sit down and say, let's think more about suffering.
Right. The one thing that I found that he didn't mention in 1 Corinthians 12, that when one part of the body suffers, all parts suffer.
Yeah, you should never suffer alone, and even if you think you are, you're not. You know, your suffering is connected. When you or when I see someone suffering, I feel for that. You know, and the closer you are to that person, the more you feel an emotional pain, a physical pain. You want to do something, but if you are distant, then they are distant from you. That there's a suffering that happens there as well, and that is a struggle. It does make parts of the body suffer without. You may think it's not, but it is, because we like to do it on our own, and we'll just hide it over, be over here, just won't talk to anybody for a while.
Independent.
And the body's wondering what's going on, and it's causing this tension within them, and you think you're just protecting everybody, but that's causing other people to suffer.
Yeah.
It's better and more Christ-like to share in our suffering, to spread our burdens that way, because others may not be suffering as much. Others may have the weight lifted off of them so they can help carry your weight. And
right.
as Christ says, then we can all put it on Christ.
Yeah.
And that's part of that. But it will drag each other down. But we don't recognize that. I think when most of us go through a suffering, at some point in there, we're just pretty selfish about it. And the rest of the world is like, oh, they're all fine. I'm going through this.
Oh, woe is me.
Woe is me type of thing. And so if we shift our view to understanding God's purpose in it, spending the time to think about what's happening here. Why is it happening? Is there part of this that is my fault? Did I do some of this? I remember, my father, when he first had to have his first heart surgery, it comes down to, there's a lifelong pattern of eating that has led to some of this. Now, there's also genetics, but there's a lifelong pattern of eating that has led to some of this. I have to start to change that. So there's a part that is your fault. There are other complications, other things. That's not his fault. So then that's more, we're just in a broken world. So you had both things happening at the same time. And walking through that process. It is definitely a journey for sure.
Yeah, I have a friend who in their approach to suffering is like, I want to learn the lesson the first time. I don't want God to get the baseball bat out to drum it into my head.
Yes. Well, I mean, that's true too. I want to learn but the first time could take a while, It's true. It is a way to process that. So I would just encourage people, if you're listening, to think through, spend some time in, if you're suffering, or whether big or small. I think first is recognize you're not alone. One, God is there, and he is a part of that and a shaping in that. You're not alone if you're part of the body of Christ. He has called others to be with you, so don't be, I would say, don't be selfish with it. Share, because you never know the ease of suffering that comes from the sharing. But the only way you can get through that process is if you actually sit down and process and think about these different items, these things. Why am I suffering? Where is it? How am I responding to it? Yeah. What we'll do is we'll put a link to this full article. I think it's a very good introduction. There's a lot more in here that we didn't share, but it's a very good introduction into this. And take some time and think about that. I think it's a good time, as spring is in the air, even if you're suffering, to be outside in the sunshine for a moment and then think about that and let your mind and spirit walk through that with the Lord. But there is a purpose, and I believe the bigger thing is we recognize God is there, and he is shaping us. And anybody who knows that you appreciate the coach or you appreciate the parent because they're shaping someone because they love them.
Yes.
They want the best for them.
That's
and how
right.
much more so your creator who says, I care about you enough to shape you, to make you more like Christ.
Right.
Does that make the suffering go away? No. But that does give me a perspective that this is something that now I need to cooperate with and see where God is shaping me. So take some time this week, sit down, contemplate that, and see where God is shaping you. Have a good week.
Take care.